Hello. Hello, all. Thank you. Thank you for joining Duke Science and Society for this seventh installment of our coronavirus conversations. My name is Tim McDermott. I am the event manager at Duke Science and Society. I'm very excited that you could join us. I'm here in my home studio, my lovely home office slash home slash everything at this point. So hopefully you all are comfortable. Just a few housekeeping notes before I go ahead and introduce our guests. The chat is open. So if you would like to, if you'd like to share a question, ask a question of anyone on the panel, you can message Tim McDermott or Ben Shepard, and we will accept your questions, and we'll try and get through to as many as we can. Should we experience any technical difficulties and you lose connection, if you just go back to your email and pop right back in with the link, you shouldn't have any problem reconnecting. And then be sure to head over to our website, Duke Science and Society, to check out our next coronavirus conversation next week, May 6th, when we will discuss the pandemic impact on underserved communities. And while you're there, you can also learn about our master's program, where our students and our faculty address the issues we have discussed in these conversations on a daily basis. This is the content that you get here is what you would be getting from any classroom, any of our classroom time. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Nita Farahani is the director of Duke, the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. She is a professor of law and philosophy here at Duke. For 7 years, she sat on the president for the study of bioethical issues. She is also the co-editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Journal of Law and Bioethics. And she has multiple degrees from Duke University, PhD, JD. So she is a lifelong Dukey at this point. Welcome, Dr. Farhad. Ooh, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for arranging this.
Absolutely. And then down here we have Dr. Gavin Yamey. Am I saying that right, Dr. Yamey? Oh, hold on. Sorry about that.
Yes, Gavin Yamey. You can say Yamey, Yami, Yami, whatever you want. It's a Lithuanian Jewish refugee name that got anglicized after the Holocaust. There you go.
That makes sense. So Dr. Gavin Yamey is the Associate Director for Policy at the Duke Global Health Institute, the Director of the Center for Policy Impacting Global Health, and a Professor of Practice of Global Health and Public Policy in the Sanford School. There are several other titles he holds, but we would be here all day, so we'll just do those for now, if that's okay, Dr. Yamey.
Yes, WXDU DJ. Duke has one of the oldest college radio stations. It's shut down right now, but I'm a proud XDU DJ as well. You left out the most important thing.
Well, yes, I did. No, I have the most important part here at the end here. Dr. Yamey holds MD, MPH, and MA degrees, and his work focuses on global health, neglected diseases, and disparities in health outcomes. In addition to all that, if you go to his Twitter feed right now, you will be able to see that he has some very cool suede double monks on and some very loud socks, which I very much respect, sir. So
yeah, you know what? We've got to just do this. Here we go. Oh no, the socks are not
no.
Oh, there you go. Oh, there they are. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, I'm going to be more professional now. I'm gonna be much more professional.
If you ever see him doing one of these panels, check his Twitter feed from that morning, and you will see the socks and shoes that he is wearing. Finally, Professor Asher Hildebrand is an associate professor of the practice in the Sanford School of Public Policy. But before that, he was the chief of staff to Representative David here in North Carolina. Which district is that?
4th district, though it changes about every 3 years, so I won't characterize it beyond that.
It's probably for the best with what it's going through right now. And in addition to that, he was the director of policy and research for President Obama's 2012 campaign here in North Carolina. Professor Hildebrand focuses on discussions of federalism, legislative advocacy and lobbying, and U.S. foreign policy. Now, he did go to UNC for his undergrad work, but we will try not to hold that against him because he has agreed to join us for this panel. So, Nita, please take us away.
Great. Asher, Gavin, thanks so much for being here today with us, or at least where you are with us, to have this conversation. Last week, we talked about Durham, and we had Mike Schoenfeld here with us, as well as the Mayor Pro Tem, Jillian Johnson, talking about the local response and North Carolina response. And we wanted to shift our focus this week to really focusing on the federal and international response. Both of you have been pretty vocal about the ways in which I think the federal government really didn't act quickly enough and effectively enough to enable us to have an early and perhaps more hopeful outcome than we currently have. And so I wanted to focus this conversation really, how did we get here? What does the current federal and international response look like? And what can we anticipate from here? Building on the commentary that you guys have already provided pretty extensively. So I thought we would start by having you each just give a few, kind of your perspective on how we got here and where here is with respect to federal and international responses to this, as well as where we're going. And then I'll engage in a kind of discussion and hopefully have the two of you, able to discuss with one another. So if we could start with Asher with just a few minutes of, overview of kind of how you think what the response you feel like has been like so far, how we got here and where we are.
Thanks, and again, thanks for including me. It's far preferable to be doing this kind of discussion today than some of the other things I could be doing at home, and so appreciate it. Also appreciate Science and Society convening this series of conversations, which have been very interesting. So, I see, I do look at this from a perspective, from kind of a governance perspective, and from the perspective of what should the federal government, as distinct from the states, distinct from local government, be doing for a crisis of this magnitude. And I see 4 areas where I think the government's role is both indispensable and, in this case, has been somewhat wanting, although to varying degrees. First, in detecting the spread of the virus, right? Of course, about testing, contact trace, detection measures. And this was really the signature failure of the early weeks of the pandemic, because it took a strategy of containment off the table, which left us with no choice but to impose extreme social distancing and consequently extreme economic suffering. And I think that's an important point here, is that just the severity of the economic pain has been related to that early failure, because things are stricter than they maybe would have had to be otherwise. The second is in the coordination of the deployment of critical resources to the places that needed them most. And this is probably the second major failure of the federal government's response. So centralizing the supply chain, distribution, hear a lot about PPE, ventilators, et cetera. And that's a matter of saving lives, of course, but also saving probably billions of dollars in money that's spent for those things that instead of using the federal government's buying power to help centralize that. And I guess, to be fair, our country is a little less equipped than other countries to undertake that sort of massive centralized mobilization. But we've done it before, and the minimal tools that were available to us are available to us, such as the Defense Production Act and the National Stockpile, were deployed slowly and erratically in the early stages of the crisis. And so it's kind of left us with a worst of both worlds situation, with the federal government not only refusing to intervene in the market and competing against states and hospitals and local governments in some cases to procure equipment, and not to mention turning the national stockpile by some accounts into sort of a political patronage network. And the president himself said at one point, we're not a shipping clerk to the governors. Third area is in providing sort of guidance and rhetorical leadership to sustain the country through this current period of lockdown, and articulating a path forward for the coming weeks or months or years until a vaccine is produced. And I think the president's phased plan is fairly reasonable under the circumstances, reflecting the always tenuous influence of some of his public health officials. But there are a lot of caveats here. First, as we've seen from some epidemiology studies, earlier nationwide guidance on social distancing could have saved lives, so the plan probably came too late. Second, it's pretty telling that the very first centralized plan that the federal government has offered has focused on reopening the economy instead of other aspects of the crisis. This is putting it lightly, but it hasn't exactly been accompanied by consistent rhetorical leadership on the part of the president in terms of kind of sticking through this phase. And he's now shifted to a pretty cool message in support of states relaxing their restrictions and reopening the economy. And then also fairly, as many have pointed out, fairly fanciful to think that we could proceed with this reopening without a more coordinated national testing strategy. And then fourth, just close here, the other area where I think the federal government's role is indispensable is in providing just the massive infusion of resources and relief for relief and recovery that's needed. And I will give Congress some credit for what it's done so far, recognizing the scale of the crisis and multiple relief packages that have already dwarfed anything we did during the last financial crisis, and doing so with broad bipartisan support and without actually really meeting except for a couple of times. But there are lots of caveats here too, of course. This is just the first stage of what really needs to be done for relief, let alone for a period. And there's been revealed about the frailty of Congress's own operation this time. And that's an issue not just for drafting additional legislative packages, but also for overseeing the trillions of dollars that are already going out the door and try to hold the government accountable for that. Just in the past, we've seen the bipartisan consensus that's sort of gotten us this far in Congress beginning to fray, and so questions about additional packages from Congress and the road ahead. But let me stop there and let Dr. Yami fill
those are very helpful opening remarks, helping us to set the stage for the conversation. Gavin, if I could bring it over to you for your opening remarks.
Sure. I mean, thanks, Nita. Thanks to Science and Society, and thanks to Asha for, I think, a remarkable summary that I cannot improve on from a domestic point of view. Maybe it would be helpful for me to take a more international view. Obviously, by now, the facts are well known where the virus originated. It's pretty well known now that the WHO made it very clear, January the 23rd, its international committee, its emergency committee, told the world, it told every single country to get ready. It said this virus is coming, there will inevitably be transmission in your country, and you need to prepare. And it really was very clear about human-to-human transmission, about the fact that you need to do testing, contact tracing, isolation of infected people, and quarantine. And then what you see worldwide is a divergence amongst countries in their seriousness, in their efforts to get ready. Some countries took the WHO's advice very seriously. Some countries were very based on data and science. And of course, some countries had the memory of MERS, they had the memory of SARS, and they had previously identified weaknesses in their system that they had fixed. So you can see South Korea, the US getting their first case pretty much the same day or within days of each other, and those two countries following very divergent paths. I wrote about this in a column for Time magazine. South Korea demonstrates, I think, an evidence-based approach with, you could say, 5 T's, right? Mass testing, including drive-through testing centers, contact tracing. So that means, when someone has been infected, you trace who they've been in contact with, you test them, and you quarantine them. Treatment, by treatment, I'm personal protective equipment. On the therapy side, making sure that every health worker has high quality personal protective equipment. The 4th T, it's really critical, and that is trust. That it is absolutely the case that the government had the trust of the people, and they were going on television every day. Their leaders were telling people what was going on, numbers of cases, and they had the trust of the populace. And I would add a 5th T, which is technology. They use technology smartly now, and perhaps we'll get into a discussion about you know, what kinds of potential civil liberties are lost when you use technologies for tracing. But again, I think because they were able to use GPS, you know, iPhone and car GPS for contact tracing. They had some really smart apps. Everybody, you know, who arrived in South Korea from overseas was asked to download an app to monitor their symptoms. And you will have seen the news that I think it was yesterday or the day before. I can't even remember time anymore, what day we're at. But South Korea announced that it had the first day with no new domestic cases. You can see a very divergent path here in the United States that Asha has so beautifully described. The downplaying of the seriousness from the Trump administration. I published a piece a week ago with Greg Gonsalves at Yale, and you know, what we really did was just to go back and look at the facts, look at President Trump's announcements, look at what he said. We didn't do much more than that, really, than to lay out the story. And it is very clear that throughout January and February, and to be honest, even into March, he was saying, you know, we're in good shape, it's under control. You know, I've got his exact words here, but he was really downplaying the risk and he was downplaying the seriousness. And that was really problematic. The kinds of measures that Asha said could have been put in place, you know, didn't happen. And, you know, China's lockdown and China's very, you know, what were called at the time draconian measures that pretty much every country has now emulated, bought us time, and we didn't use that time. You know, the CDC famously bungled its tests that it was developing. It was a WHO approved test that we decided not to use. It took weeks and weeks to identify the problem and fix it. We lost so much time. We didn't use the kinds of levers that Asha mentioned to scale up the production of things like personal protective equipment. You have the CDC telling health workers to use bandanas because we didn't have N95 masks. We lost so much time. We should have been getting contact tracing in place. We should have been, you know, getting hospitals ready for surges. None of that happened. So you do see this divergence. And I'm just going to make two final points. One is even countries that have done well, Singapore, have forgotten certain populations. And that is a lesson to us. Singapore has now, it did well to control its epidemic, but it forgot about migrant workers. There's a population of about 6 million people. It has 300,000 migrant workers living in appalling conditions, 12 to 20 people in a dormitory. Out of sight, out of mind communities, they had an outbreak in that population, and the epidemic has spiraled out of control. The lesson there is we need to think about people who are at the margins or in congregate settings. I've been working quite a lot with the Justice and the ACLU here. We were very worried months ago about jails and prisons, and unfortunately our deepest fears have come true. So we have to, everywhere around the world has to be thinking about jails and prisons and homeless migrant communities. That's the first thing to say. And then the second thing to say is and this probably doesn't need much more than that there has been a leaving politics aside, a denigration of science over the last few years that has been really perilous. And obviously Trump's statements about inhaling or ingesting bleach, obviously Trump's statements about, you know, encouraging people to break stay-at-home orders en masse and mentioning Second Amendment in the same voice, deeply unhelpful from a scientific and public health point of view. And so that I think the way in which, you know, this administration has downplayed science and has downplayed evidence, and even before the pandemic hit, taken steps to weaken our pandemic preparedness system. You know, it's no coincidence that now we are the global epicenter with a third of the world's cases. So many deaths could have been avoided, and so many infections could have been avoided for many of the reasons that Asha mentioned.
Thank you. You both paint a bleak picture. I'll add a couple of comments before turning it back to you, which is one, you know, as an initiative on science and society, it's of course one of the critical parts of our mission is trying to ensure that the public and the decision makers are making evidence-based decisions, that we're using science for the good of society, that we're recognizing the importance of society. And of course, it's been discouraging to see science denialism at every and how destructive that's been, and seeing the implications for that. The second is, as Tim mentioned, I served on President Obama's Bioethics Commission, which was a great experience, also really helpful, I hope, to the government at times when there were bioethics crises and other questions that arose. In fact, every president dating back to President Carter has had some form of a bioethics commission. They've named them something different, but they've all had one. This is the first time there hasn't been one, since Carter. And that's problematic too, because not only are there national level science questions, there are national level ethical questions that have arisen that we really needed to address as well. But on this kind of bleak picture of how we got here, I want to establish the facts on that a little bit more before we move forward to something which I hope is a more hopeful conversation, which is where we can go from here, understanding the multiple failures that got us here. I know a lot of people have asked the question, and some of the people who have submitted questions in advance of this conversation are confused on a couple of points. One is why the CDC decided to develop its own test, which we know ultimately failed, instead of using the World Health Organization approved test. Like, what was the rationale? Is it a purely political one? Was there something about access or production? Just the facts, to the extent that you can provide those facts to us. And the second is in the face of the lack of a federal response to this, and a federal response that was really significance of what we were seeing, not taking advantage of the time. Was there something more that states could have been doing to have acted? Now, of course, they don't have the collective buying power and the capability of doing what the federal government could have done in a coordinated response. Given our system of federalism, and given the fact that governors have played such a central role, what should they have been doing, and what could they have been doing to have better navigated this and have better prepared their own states for the coming deluge that we ultimately have experienced? And I'm happy for either of you to jump in first. We can go in reverse order if you want, with Gavin and then back to Asher, or back to Asher and then Gavin to respond to those.
I'll happily defer to Gavin on the CDC question.
Okay. Gavin, do you have a sense of what
CDC
drove that?
It's a good question. And I have been looking into it a little bit. I think the first thing to say is it's not unusual in this sort of a situation that the US federal government would look to the CDC, right? The CDC is one of the finest public health agencies on earth. In previous outbreaks, it has been the one to lead diagnostics, and actually generally to lead the national response. And it's very telling that it's been so silent. I mean, they push back when reporters have said, where have you been? They say, well, we're behind the scenes. But it's been very, very unusual to see them so behind the scenes. I've also tried to get at this. There was a story circulating, and I think fact checkers have concluded that it's probably not exactly accurate. The story was that the WHO said it would ship tests to the US. Doesn't appear that that's quite right. There's a WHO communications person on record as saying it's not that we had offered to ship tests. It's that the WHO had a test ready that the US could have used, and the US declined. Again, apparently that's not unusual. What is tragic, of course, is that they wasted so many weeks. There has been a lot of reporting on what went wrong. There was a whole catalogue of areas that went wrong in the CDC's own development of a test, and also in what went wrong in taking so much time to discover that the test was faulty. And so, many of us, myself included, had wondered whether there was some sort of inward-looking, nationalistic, America first, me too kind of view. I do think there has been that view broadly, and I do think it's probably no coincidence that, both Brexit Britain and Trump's America, countries that looked inwards, that turned inwards, that really didn't really follow WHO's guidance, that I think felt that this wasn't going to hit them in some way, that they were special, are both really struggling with containing their epidemics. Two of the hardest hit countries, I do think that was probably an element in this, but I do understand why why the US government looked at the CDC first. The tragedy, of course, is that they could have gone a different route.
That's right, but that sounds like that's hindsight based on your kind of analysis, right? Which is that in the past, and given its role and leadership role that it's taken, we might have expected, had it been successful in the test that it did.
Yes.
Might have.
No, I think that's reasonable, and I think it is absolutely true that although Trump's budget year on year called for massive cuts to CDC, a bipartisan Congress largely was successful in rejecting the overall levels. Having said that, there were still cuts to key programs within CDC on epidemic and pandemic preparedness, for sure. And there were other cuts that have been well reported. The shuttering of this wonderful USAID program called PREDICT, that was actually trying to predict which viruses would become pandemics. That's well described. Closing the White House office that was responsible for pandemic preparedness. I mean, there were multiple steps taken, within these federal agencies that were supposed to be working on pandemic preparedness. I don't know whether you can join the dots between those, cuts to staff and cuts to resources and cuts to budgets and the CDC dropping the ball. I don't have that data.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. In the past and in past pandemics, we could have looked at the CDC, and we could have also, the world community could have looked at the CDC. And that's, again, I'm finding this very painful as a US citizen, that normally the US would be really, out in front in a global pandemic situation like this. And it's painful watching these, European meetings, this international collaboration, this new accelerator that is combining forces on developing COVID-19 treatments and diagnostics and vaccines, and the US is absent. This is a very, very unusual, regardless of, whether it's been a Republican or or Democratic past. The US has always been out front, and it is.
I mean, in fact, there have been multiple articles that, that have been written talking about that this is the moment to look back to that really underscore the decline of America. I hope that isn't true. I hope that we won't end up in that place. And so we're going to get to the more hopeful part of the conversation, but I wanted to just invite Asher to weigh in on, governors' responses and states' responses, recognizing, as you've laid out, that there's a critical importance and role that the federal government can play in leveraging its buying power to enable a much more coordinated response in the absence of that. And in a country where states' rights, matter to a lot of people, and, especially in something that's really unprecedented, at least in our lifetime, of seeing the kind of closures and, as Gavin mentions, and we'll get to, questions about the balance between civil liberties and responses by governments. Should states have been doing a lot more? Were they doing all that they could doing in light of the federal response that we saw?
It's a very good question. And in fact, I think one of the most fascinating aspects of this crisis overall is this question of what should the federal government versus the state governments be doing, and in particular, the extent to which the president has delegated and deflected responsibility for leading the response back to the states. In addition to infamously denying his personal responsibility for the crisis, he's also said time and time again, the states are in the lead. The federal government isn't responsible for tests. We're not going to be on every street corner with tests. For coordinating supplies, we're not a shipping clerk. And after briefly saying that he had the ultimate authority to decide when to reopen, he backtracked on that, of course, and said, no, after all, it's up to the governors. And I see this as less a case of governors kind of claiming the limelight and asserting their states' rights than a case of the federal government leaving a massive leadership vacuum into which the governors have stepped, some with more reluctance than others, right? Governor Cuomo has received a lot of it and has, I think, kind of effectively channeled the nation's yearning for decisive leadership at this time of crisis. But there are plenty of other governors, probably with better performance records than Cuomo, who have not had as much attention, and that includes Republicans. And I think this is fascinating, not just because it is kind of introduced into this drama, these new characters with all of their strengths and their flaws, but also because Americans' experience of the crisis is and is going to be different depending on where they live, right? If they live in Atlanta or New York City or North Carolina or Nevada, it's going to be a lot different. And that's been the case all along, but it's now that states like Georgia and Texas are beginning to reopen, we're going to see that even more. And so, you know, political scientists tend to divide up American history into these eras of federalism. You may remember from your civics class, you know, marble cake federalism and layer cake federalism. And in the latter half of the 20th century, we had cooperative federalism, where the federal government and states work together to administer programs. A lot of people have called the last decade or so uncooperative federalism, where states have kind of polarized along partisan and ideological lines and have supported federal intervention or opposed it based on who held the power. I don't know what to call the current era right now, or the current situation. Maybe absentee federalism or anarchic federalism or something. But I think it has been just fascinating to watch. I don't know what the long-term trends will be. You know, I need to proclaim a new era, but I do think we'll probably see governors more willing to assert themselves and sort of not wait for the federal government to take the lead in a number of issues in the future. And finally, just to address your question directly, I mean, could the governors have done more? Yes, absolutely. I don't think there's any governor in the country who doesn't wish they had done more in the early stages of this. I do think most governors had a reasonable expectation that they would see more leadership from the federal government. And it took a while to become clear, as it is abundantly clear now, that the federal government would not be offering that leadership. For example, just last week, finally the national testing strategy was posted to coronavirus.gov. I used air quotes there because it's not in fact a national testing strategy. It basically says actually it's up to the states to do all of this, which only confirms what many of them had begun to expect. So that's not to say I'm not critical of individual governors for some of the decisions they've made. I think there's a lot of criticism to be leveled there, but I don't blame them as a group for being, behind the ball when they were looking to the federal government to take the lead.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that will be interesting in time, of course, is how much of this will be rewritten history, right? The moments at which critical decisions were poorly made, how much of it was denialism, how much of it was optimism, how much of it was lack of information, how much of it was misinformation at the time, which I think some of it we can see now, some of it will reveal itself more in time. But as we go through this, Gavin mentions trust, and I think implicitly in a lot of what you've been saying, Asher, is this issue of trust. I've been a little bit fascinated by Sweden's response to the pandemic. I think the world is watching, of course, given that they've taken such a different approach to how they have dealt with this, right? Which is there's no lockdown there. They are seeing rising numbers, but the numbers are not so much worse than in other countries, although it remains to be seen if they're going to end up increasing. But it seems like part of what's really different there is trust of each other, and trust of people, which is an expectation that they'll respond in particular ways, that if the government provides advice and counsel for how they will in fact interact in those ways. Not that I think that that's a particularly good example. It's just an example, right? Which is the Swedish approach. Gavin has written about South Korea and the leadership and kind of approach that they've taken. We have these different models going on right now. What's clear about our model is we don't have trust in the federal government. We don't have trust, whether it's governors, we don't have trust as individuals. And so, as we all look toward the whole next stage of the pandemic, and I don't think we're there yet of phase 2, although you're already seeing governors opening states like Georgia, how do we get from here to there in a place where we don't have fundamental trust? And I ask that because I don't think we're suddenly going to manage to have that in this country, right? We had already bipartisan gridlock. We spent most of January in impeachment proceedings while this pandemic was unfolding, just underscoring how deeply divided our government is. It's a miracle that we've had bipartisan response to these relief measures, but I doubt that we'll continue to have that going forward. How is the American public going to take the next step forward in light of the fundamental lack of trust that people have in government at this point?
Very easy question. I'll punt that one to Asha since it's so easy. So, I mean, I think, well, Nita, I think it's important to remember also that South Korea did not lock down.
Right.
So they achieved what they achieved without a lockdown. And I do think that trust was a big part of it.
Yeah. But they achieved it with massive testing, right? I mean, massive testing and tracing that we don't have coming online here. So
exactly. So the combination of massive testing. And I think that I just got a comment in the chat room as well, that the other element that is really critical here, I think, is the broader health system, whether you do or do not have universal health coverage, whether you have a social safety net. You know that the piece that I wrote last week with Greg Gonsalves, with the very subtle title, Donald Trump, a political determinant of COVID-19, we actually end on I think on a hopeful note. I mean, we end by saying, look, clearly the Trump administration will not, actually it cannot save us. We're kind of alone, but we're not alone amongst ourselves. We are alone, to form without the federal government a new social movement, right? And that is where I think the future now lies, and it's partisan social movement. One that
recognizes what you called it something in that article. It wasn't just
a new politics of compassion. I think that's really what it's about, and I am actually quite hopeful that we might see some bipartisanship over this. The first time that I thought, wow, this could be a little bit different was many, many weeks ago when I wrote a piece about how COVID-19 testing should be free to all Americans, even the uninsured. And you had Republican politicians actually going on television saying, they hadn't read my piece necessarily, but just saying, right now, COVID-19 testing treatment should be free. And I thought, that is actually quite remarkable. I think people are starting to get it now that we are very interconnected. And if someone else is sick with 19, they're putting us at risk. Now, I happen to think, we should have healthcare for all as a matter of justice and rights. But if the argument has to be, actually, someone else's health is my health right now, so be it. It's making those linkages. So I think what we called for in our piece at the end was this politics of compassion, sort of a politics of care that does need to include universal basic income. It does need to include universal health coverage. There are going to be people who are staying at home for long periods. We're going to need rent assistance. We're going to need food assistance. And as I said earlier today, we are also going to have to think about the most vulnerable, right? There's no public health without prison health. There's no public health without migrant health. There's no public health without homeless. We had
But Gavin, let me pause you here just to say, I don't want to be the pessimist, but I'm going to be a little pessimistic,
Sure.
Which is, I see that the politics of compassion that you're talking about as where we ultimately as a society transformatively have to get from COVID-19. But I'm talking about literally just from where we are right now to phase 2. Next phase. And what I'm worried about is, you both mentioned trust. There is a fundamental lack of trust right now in the federal government, for many in state government. And I think there's been so much mistrust that you see a lot of people talking about, even if we get to the point where we have adequate testing, which we don't have anywhere close to it, that people don't necessarily want to take the tests if they're asymptomatic. The Google and Apple contact tracing, apps and other apps that are coming online, you have surveys of the American public saying they wouldn't participate because they don't trust how that data will be used or misused against them. And so, if we don't have trust, and we're just talking about from here to the baby step of the next step of the pandemic, I agree with you. That's a hopeful and lovely future you point us toward, Gavin. But like literally to get here to the next step, which we also desperately want, because I think we're all going stir crazy in our current environments, and desperate for hope and optimism. How do we get to the next step? And Asher, either with optimism or pessimism, what do you think?
Some measure of both. I'll try to inject some measure of both. I actually got a slightly more nuanced attitude toward the question of trust. We've seen, and this is reflective in right track, wrong track measuring. I mean, somewhat paradoxically, right? The number just in North Carolina in recent polls, the number of people saying we're on the right track is higher than at any time in like the last 5 years. It's reflective in support individual public leaders, of course, governors especially. There's certainly a trust gap and a support gap for the president. But you have seen people, supporting their sort of rallying around maybe their state flags instead of their national flag right now. And you've seen continued high public support for social distancing measures, which I think reflects some degree of trust in what our leaders are saying. A poll this morning I just pulled up had 83% supporting continuing social distancing measures right now nationally. You've also seen a shift in public attitude, government intervention areas of policy, kind of downstream areas of policy, like healthcare, like paid leave. And that shift has actually been, according to many polls, mostly among conservative and Republican voters. So in one poll, voters were asked, should the government take an aggressive role in the economy or stand out of the way? And people who supported the former had increased by 13 points in the last couple of months, and that was almost exclusively among Trump supporters. So I think there are some positive signs there. What I worry about is the inconsistency right now, and this is my pessimism, is kind of because we're starting to diverge again after this very brief period of if it was ever consistent at the top, I'm not sure, but this very brief period in which everybody seemed to acknowledge, okay, we've got to lock down, we've got to take this seriously. We're now seeing divergence among states going different ways, among members of Congress, even debating when Congress should reconvene, with Democrats and Republicans now question. And of course, the president, always erratic, always inconsistent. And so I think that inconsistency, squandering the opportunity to capitalize on the public's receptivity towards stable, consistent guidance from their leaders right now. And so I guess, again, that's somewhat pessimistic, optimistic, because I'm not sure we can sort of put the rabbit back in the hat now that it's out. But I do think people want leadership right now. They want trust. Leaders are doing the right thing. Their leaders are just making it hard for them to do that sometimes.
Well, on that front, I mean, one of the questions our participants have asked today is, it has not escaped anybody's attention that it's an election year. And it's, pretty unfortunate actually to have a global pandemic during an election year, because one of the concerns that a lot of people have is, how much of the response, whether from the Trump administration or from any individual state, is going to be driven based on polling rather than based on science and data about what's in the best interest of, health and what's in the best interest of the people, right? What's going to play best to voters versus what's going to maybe be hugely unpopular, but incredibly critical to being able to get to the point of recovery and get to the point of safety. And so, should politics be part of the conversation right now? How have politics, infiltrated the response to all levels of the pandemic? What's the role of politics in all of this from your perspective? And I see Gavin is ready.
Yeah, just because there's some data on this.
Oh, great! I love data.
We love data. I should just say it's a preprint. One of the many fascinating aspects of the scientific response to COVID-19 has been the use of preprints. You know, every single physicist on the planet has always shared a preprint in archive.org, every single one before submission to a journal, but the health community has been that until now. So all of a sudden, every COVID-19 paper is in a preprint server. So there's a preprint from the University of Washington, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, Christopher Adolph and colleagues. It's worth looking at. And the title of it is called Pandemic Politics. And it looks at which states actually instituted stay-at-home measures first, lockdown measures first. And states that had a Republican governor or a high percentage of Trump supporters were later in taking action than other states. So we already see politics at play. Politics at play here. Although I haven't seen a similar.
Where is North Carolina in that, given that we're a purple odd state? Do you know?
You know what? I haven't seen a breakdown by state in the preprint.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's aggregate data. I don't know if they did that on purpose. So I'll write to them and ask. One of them is a friend of mine. What I haven't seen is a similar study on when states are when they're releasing their lockdowns. But the earlier states have been ones with Republican governors, and I've been really nervous about that. I was asked yesterday onto a program to talk about Texas, which, as you know, is opening up. And actually, the number of new cases per day in the last 4 days in Texas has been rising. That's exactly when you do not want to be opened up, right? You need to put politics aside. Obviously, politics are at play right now in the decisions about opening up the economy, whatever that means. This distinction between the economy and human beings is bizarre. But anyway, there are a number of conditions that need to be met before you can think about opening up. And those conditions really are uncontroversial and apolitical. You cannot have rising numbers of new cases. You absolutely have to have prolonged declines. Days, say many experts. The famous Scott Gottlieb plan, a very sensible plan, said 14 days. You need to have mass testing and contact tracing. You need to have personal protective equipment for health workers. You need hospitals ready. There's actually no state meets those criteria right now.
Yeah, I like the Gottlieb plan. I do wish that Gottlieb was still the head of the FDA. But Asher, what do you think? We're in an election year. How have politics played a role? What role do you think that they should continue to play in this?
Well, it won't surprise you probably for me to say that we have to consider politics, and I mean that in part in a direct sense, in that I do think there's been plenty of people paying attention to it, but collectively there's been probably an underappreciation of the implications that this might have for the November election. In North Carolina, for example, they're finalizing the state's major relief package, and our state Senate right now is saying, well, we're not even going to provide the minimum funding needed to unlock the federal funding that's been provided here. We're just going to deal with this later. So I worry about that. I think in the more big picture level, I think there's plenty of grounds for cynicism about the motivation driving the White House's decision making in terms of how politics are intervening. And I think there's plenty of grounds for despair about the variable state responses, how some states have, the governor of Oklahoma not only delaying any kind of shutdown of business, but actually posting pictures of his family out at a packed restaurant after most states had already shut down their restaurants, right? And so there is this kind of ideological aspect to this that is very troubling. I think if I were looking for silver lining here, it would be in the notion that good politics and good science are not mutually exclusive as we look ahead here. And I think North Carolina is a pretty good example of that as well. I think Governor Cooper has made very clear and consistent that our decision, he's got this phased plan, but that progressing through that plan will be contingent on meeting these science-based benchmarks. And he said that again and again and again. And as of right, he's as strong in his public support and in his head-to-head polls against his opponent this year as at any point in his administration. And so there too, I think people have responded well to the consistency. He's got majority support from Republican voters in North Carolina, right? So I think people are responding well to the consistency and to the clear message that, yes, things will get better, but we're going to base this decision on science and not based on ideology.
We're a weird state, though, Asher, you might admit, and
to say the least.
So I worry about what that's going to look like on the national level, particularly given that we really are going to have a coordinated national response. I think in some ways. I mean, so we've mentioned a little bit the South Korea response. What's happened in other countries, in Sweden. Trump announced originally that he was going to shut down all immigration. And it's just for people who are seeking a green card for the next 60 days. I'm not sure how that really makes any sense in light of what we're looking for with respect to trying to slow, bringing it here. But, I mentioned earlier a number of the articles that people have written, the end of the American era of hegemony, the end of, American leadership, the concerns about CDC, as Gavin points out, where we were the world leader, people could turn to us and no longer can. What's this going to look like from your perspective going forward internationally? Are we going to see decreased engagements on, and kind of increased justification for more anti-immigration stances and pulling back into our own country? Do we need a coordinated international response to really get to the final reopening phase of the pandemic? What does it look like from here? I'm sure yes, but I mean, understanding where we are politically too, Gavin, what is it?
I mean,
what are your predictions? I know there's the hopeful, and I love that you're hopeful, Gavin. I think that's terrific. But I want the reality and the hopeful response of what does it look like for America from here with respect to our engagement on the international scene.
Well, let me just quickly talk about the international, what's ahead. I mean, the first thing that's ahead for everybody, for every country, almost certainly, is cycles. Yeah. Cycles and waves of COVID-19 outbreaks. I'm sorry to say, I wish it weren't true.
I mean, we heard
but we are probably going to have lockdown, relax, lockdown, relax, lockdown, relax. And that's part of the reason why building trust is so important, because you're building trust that allows you to turn on the fire extinguisher when you are inevitably going to have to turn it on again.
Yeah.
And I happen to think, as many other public health folks would say is true, that we probably cannot end this pandemic until we have a vaccine. And even if we have a vaccine, it will initially be of limited supply. Everyone is talking about having $1 to $2 billion doses ready. If we have 1 billion doses, obviously that's not going to vaccinate the world. It'll vaccinate 13%-ish of the world. And that's why we're going to need international cooperation and collaboration. Because otherwise you will get rich countries entering into bilateral purchase agreements with companies making the vaccine. They will want to hoard it. We've already seen hoarding behavior. Trump is reported to have tried to buy a German company that's making the vaccine. We know that there's a Belgian company, Universals, that will be manufacturing the vaccine. And one rich country has already agreed to buy half of the supply. We've seen this with ventilators and face masks, rich countries hoarding. If that happens, we'll never end the pandemic, because if you've got transmission in any country, it's going to inevitably come back to our country. And so we're going to have to have the greatest international collaboration that has ever been seen, completely unprecedented, where we agree on the rules of the game up front before we even have a vaccine. And those rules have to be countries that have an uncontrolled epidemic that's still on fire, particularly if they have weak health systems, they're low-income countries, they have to take precedence over, rich countries that have controlled their epidemic. Also, it cannot be based on ability to pay, quite clearly. That would be highly unethical and unjust. So getting those rules in place and getting those agreements in place, we are starting to see amazing political will around that. I mean, honestly, I've been surprised with even industry on board. Again, we're going to have to hold their feet to the fire. They're saying all the right things. You've got some of the most powerful trade lobbies, like the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations, on board with this plan, or a plan like this. Again, the devil is in the details. Nothing's been signed, but we are seeing political will. The G7, the G20, Where's the United States on this? Again, pretty much absent. And I can see there's a lot of nationalism at play now in trying to ensure that we get the vaccine and that it's an American vaccine. There is, of course, no such thing as an American vaccine. And that is of a tremendous concern from a public health point of view. We are not going to end our outbreak if we're not part of that international cooperation.
Asher?
God help us all when we're counting on our drug companies to save us from our politicians.
Right.
Look, I do think, like in so many areas of our society and of our politics, this crisis has laid bare long-term trends that were already evident prior to it, and the retrenchment from the international order by the United States and to a degree by other Western democracies is certainly one of those trends. So I really worry about this accelerating that trend cases to its logical conclusion. I think probably some degree of economic retrenchment, in other words, of building national supply chains for certain sectors, especially healthcare, is healthy, and that there will be maybe some silver lining there. But to me, that sort of positive or optimistic hope is overwhelmed by a sense of dread about many of the institutions created after World War II that have governed the international order, just facing some pretty severe and in some cases perhaps fatal tests from all of this. But I'm glad to hear what Gavin reports about the will being shown, especially in other places.
Again, we need to hold people to, we need to hold people accountable. J&J, as you know, has entered into a relationship with the US government, with BARDA, the agency that is essentially funding vaccine development. And they are now on public record saying they're going to make the vaccine non-profit, whatever that means. They're going to make 1 billion doses of it available to the world. Again, the devil is into the details. We need to, we need to be
Gavin,
sure.
Who is going to be holding their feet to the fire, right? I mean, that's part of what I worry about. I mean, I agree with Asher, which is really, God help us if we're relying on corporates from this pandemic. But that being said, we have just 2 minutes left. I want to offer you each a minute. I know it went far too quickly, and there's still so much we need to cover and so many questions that remain. But leaving us on a hopeful note about where we're going from here, nationally and internationally. Gavin, you've been the voice of optimism in this. So I'm going to turn to Asher, who has been a little bit less optimistic, perhaps, or more grounded, perhaps, in where we are right this very moment. But any concluding remarks from this conversation, Asher?
Yeah, I'll keep it optimistic but also stick with this kind of federalism angle and say, I just hope that governors who are Republicans and Democrats who are basing their decisions on science, who understand the long-term needs here, are taking this space given to them, ceded to them by the federal government, and sort of maximizing their activity and leading the way here. And that's going to be harder and harder as the president and other states start saying, well, no, you should reopen. And I worry about that, but let's write it out for all it's worth, because that gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, as a nation, we can make it until there's a vaccine without courting any kind of major disaster.
There's one little note of optimism on top of that, Asher, which is the coordination between the government.
That's right. That's right.
Gavin.
Yeah, I think, as I said, Greg Gonsalves had a piece that he called Alone Against the Virus. We're alone in terms of the federal government, but there's been a lot of action at the state level, at the city level, the mayors. Our mayor has been fantastic, by the way. There was, I've been doing a lot of prison work. There was some concern that our local prison might have an outbreak. He was on the phone within minutes. He's been fantastic. I think our governor has been very evidence-based, very science-based, and there's been Republican and Democratic governments who I think been incredibly impressed. Shout out to Governor Newsom. I lived in San Francisco for 14 years. I've always had it, not just because he's called Gavin and he's married to a Jen, just like me, doing gay marriage certificates early on, and he's been good. He's been good in all sorts of ways. So I think that's where I think you're going to see, so much action now. It's not going to be at the federal level, sadly, until perhaps we have a different federal government.
Well, understanding that there's a lot left in the conversation, I'm so grateful to the two of you for being willing to join us today to give us a bit of grounding as to how we got here, a little bit of an understanding of what needs to come next, a healthy dose of optimism about the potential both for where we are right now to get us to the next stages of this pandemic. We're grateful for your wisdom, we're grateful for your expertise, and I'm really grateful for your continued engagement in society to help guide us through this pandemic. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next coronavirus conversation. Stay safe and stay well. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Nita.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Asha.
Take
Bye.
care.